St. John Bosco was standing near the outer gate of the oratory when one of the boys shouted, "Watch out! Here comes a maniac! I think he's an assassin!" The man's name was Andre, and he was running straight for them, wielding a butcher knife and shouting over and over, "I want Don Bosco!" But he was only pretending to be a maniac and was actually a hitman hired by the Waldensian heretics to kill Don Bosco in retaliation for his Catholic magazine, Cattoliche, in which he had refuted so many of their doctrinal errors. In today's episode, I'll tell you how Don Bosco finally managed to get rid of Andre the Madman and how this great saint escaped other assassination attempts. The Miracles and Prophecies of St. John Bosco, a project of America Needs Fatima. I'm your host, Matthew Miller. Subscribe for new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. St. John Bosco had rushed to the safety of his room after having first locked the small iron gate at the foot of the stairs. Don Bosco's mother, Margaret, had providentially suggested that the iron gate be installed, and a good thing too, because Andre couldn't manage to get past it. He remained there, saying that he only wished to speak to Don Bosco until 9:30 that night, when the police finally showed up and arrested him. It seems unimaginable, but the criminal was somehow released from jail the next day. The authorities were obviously corrupt, and Andre the hitman was loose again, prowling around, waiting for Don Bosco to slip up. Sometime later, young John Caliero was returning home at twilight. From a distance, he glimpsed Don Bosco at the turn of a little lane leading to the oratory, and he quickened his pace to join him. As he was walking alongside the priest, he noticed Andre running wildly toward them, again in shirt sleeves. Supposing him to be drunk, they both parted to make way for him. They did it so swiftly that the force of the assailant's thrust carried him a few feet past his intended victims. Don Bosco, who at that moment had caught a brief glimpse of a knife, immediately ran toward the oratory and reached the gate. Meanwhile, Andre had wheeled around and was coming at him. Caliero now realized what the man was up to, and he shouted for help. This alarmed Andre. He hesitated for a moment and then scampered off into the night. On another occasion, Andre, this time in a different outfit, again showed up at the oratory. Not seeing Don Bosco among the boys, he said that he wanted to speak with him, and without further ado went swiftly up to his room. Caliero recognized him, and noticing that the man kept his right hand in his pocket, he suspected foul play. He quickly alerted some companions who were quite strong, and they ran after Andre. They overtook him on the balcony, forced him down the stairs, and then off the premises. As a result of this episode, he was jailed again, but was soon released for the second time. Information as to who was behind these attempts were obtained through the efforts of Commander Joseph Dupré, a great friend and benefactor of the oratory. When the commander realized that the police wouldn't provide adequate protection for Don Bosco, he took it upon himself to deal with this dangerous man who was terrorizing the entire oratory day and night. He eventually found the scoundrel, who said, "I'm being paid to do it. Pay me just as much and I'll call it off." Thereupon, Commander Dupré offered him 160 lire, which amount would cover his overdue rent bill as well as his rent for the succeeding month. Thus ended a long-standing threat which could have resulted in considerable bloodshed. Andre didn't give any further trouble, and Don Bosco forgave him everything, treating him with the kindness he always showed toward his enemies. Indeed, he even helped him, as we learned from Bishop Caliero, who later said, although Don Bosco had evicted from the Bellezza house all those tenants whose conduct was scandalous, he allowed Andre and his family to stay on. I often heard Don Bosco say, quoting the Gospel of Matthew, "Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you." There is good reason to suspect that these and many other unsuccessful traps resulted from the bribes of those who didn't take kindly to Cattoliche and wanted to silence the one responsible for that publication. They considered no cost too great if they could succeed in protecting the Waldensians from what they called Don Bosco's slander, when in reality, all he was doing was quoting Catholic doctrine. Their methods were in the tradition of their forefathers, who brutally murdered the Dominican Blessed Pavonio of Savigliano because he had preached against their doctrines and converted a large number of them to Catholicism in 1374. One Sunday afternoon, two elegantly dressed men went up to Don Bosco's room and were received with the usual courtesy. The playground was deserted because the boys were in church singing. Seeing the two men, John Caliero became suspicious and hid himself in a little room adjoining Don Bosco's, standing guard near the interconnecting door. At first, he couldn't understand what was being said very well, although the discussion was being conducted in loud tones. It sounded as if Don Bosco were refusing to agree to some proposal they had made. The two visitors then raised their voices, and Caliero heard them say, "After all, what does it matter to you whether we preach this doctrine or that doctrine? Why should you oppose us?" Don Bosco answered, "It's my duty to defend the truth and my holy faith with all my strength." "So you won't agree to stop publishing Lettori Cattoliche?" "No," replied Don Bosco resolutely. It was then that they began to threaten him with two pistols, saying, "Either you do as we tell you, or you're a dead man." "Go ahead," Don Bosco replied calmly, looking intently at them with great dignity. Just then a loud bang was heard. The two men hurriedly thrust the pistols back into their pockets. Caliero, unable to grasp the last few words which had been pronounced in a low voice, and fearing for Don Bosco's safety, had pounded on the door with all his strength, and then had rushed to call Buzzetti, who came running at once. As they were about to break into Don Bosco's room, the two men emerged, completely flustered. Don Bosco was following them humbly, beretta in hand, bidding them goodbye calmly and courteously. This was the third time that Caliero was privileged to save Don Bosco's life. The assaults against Don Bosco started in 1852 and continued intermittently for about 4 years. Gangs riled up by the Waldensians used to come to the Oratory on Sundays to bang on the door of the chapel during the sermon with stones and clubs. Sometimes their raucous shouts and the noise of the blows against the door drowned out Don Bosco's voice completely. He and the boys endured such provocations patiently for a few weeks, but finally their patience began to wear thin. Therefore, some of the boarders secretly armed themselves with clubs and stationed themselves behind the half-open door, waiting for the usual disturbance. They didn't have to wait long, but this time they were ready. John Caliero and others rushed the attackers, downed the first one in their path, and routed the others, knocking down 5 or 6 more in the process. Meanwhile, Don Bosco had interrupted his sermon to call the boys back, and they promptly obeyed. They had received a goodly number of bruises themselves in the scuffle, but they had got their message across. Gradually, the weekly disturbances ceased altogether. Aware of the cruel persecution he was suffering, all decent people grew very fond of Don Bosco and marveled that he had emerged unscathed from so many attacks. On his part, the saint remained tranquil and prayed to the Lord with the trusting words of the psalmist, "You will lead and guide me. You will free me from the snare they set for me, for you are my refuge." Thank you all so much for watching, and if you'd like to hear about more assassination attempts on St. John Bosco, just click on the link above me here. Oh, and if you'd like to know what Waldensians are, just click on this other link. God bless you, and Our Lady keep you.